first with a couple of introductions. Again, my name is Andy Mathis. This is AJ Smith and Sebastian Hill that you guys already met, along with Dr. Bloomstrom. The people from Media Services, this is Patrick Ripp and Hillary Schoenecker. They are going to be filming the interview with you, Hal Coate, and you, Leonard Rosen, on today, February 10th at 1 p.m. 2011. And we are at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And our goal is to just get some research and meet with you and have you guys share some stories about the Aviation Pioneer Association, how it was in the early industry, and a little bit more specifically involving the non-skid industry. So if you could maybe start by at least, how did you get interested in flying and where did that take you into this non-skid industry?
Well, I decided to learn to fly after World War II, and that was sort of silly because we had all of these Air Force pilots being discharged, and I was going to learn to fly and try to get a job. But it worked out, it worked well, and I was given the opportunity after I got my licenses, which I did under the GI Bill of Rights. And if you've tried to live on $65 a month, even in those times, peanut butter sandwiches was on the menu daily. But after getting all my licenses, I was offered a position. 2 weeks after I got my last license, I got a job flying an airplane. Flying strawberries out of the Imperial Valley in California. And the people that hired me to do that was one of the founders of North American Airlines, and that gave me a jump start. I was flying to Prescott as the third pilot. I would get on the airplane at Burbank, and Prescott was the first fuel stop. I'd sit on the jump seat. I wasn't allowed to touch anything. I get off in Prescott, Arizona, and you don't know it, but behind the restaurant there was 4 little cabins, and I would get off the airplane, it would go on. The restaurant manager left the back door open for me so I could get a cup of coffee and a piece of pie, and then I'd go stay in the little cabin overnight, and I'd catch the westbound airplane because the flying time between Kansas City and Burbank was 8 hours and 10 minutes. So it was 10 minutes over what a 2-man crew could do. So I got on the airplane, put my name on the Form 1, and away we went. And that made the crew legal. So that was my introduction to airline work. Shortly after that, I got checked out as a co-pilot on the airplane. And then the chief pilot quit, and I was asked to take over and become director of operation. I guess the bosses felt it was safer to have me in an office than in an airplane. But anyway, that started my 60-year airline management career, 10 of it, which are 12, was in the non-skid industry at Burbank, of which I am proud to be a member of that industry that was formed after World War II.
Do you have a specific question?
Maybe the same question. I mean, how did everything start for you and specifically with the non-skid industry?
Well, my background is basically in finance, and right after I got out of the service in 1951, I went to work for the non-scheduled airline. Actually, I worked for SkyCoach. Went to work for SkyCoach, which was a ticket agency for the non-scheduled airlines. We had offices in Burbank and all over the country, and we did the ticketing for a group of airlines. Great Lakes was one of them. Courier Transport, Trans-Alaskan Airlines were part of the initial group that we would fly passengers for. SkyCoach had would handle the ticketing, would collect the money, would pay the carriers. SkyCoach also had a reservation system where we would control the number of seats that were available between each individual stop, so that when the airline told us that they were going to go on Tuesday, we knew how many seats there were. how many people we could take between Burbank and Chicago, between Chicago and New York, and Burbank and New York. So there was an operation department that worked with SkyCoach. SkyCoach later changed its name to Transcontinental Airlines Agency. There were so many SkyCoaches, the name became sort of misleading. So we changed our name to Transcontinental Airlines Agency. But I lasted with the company until it went out of business in 1962, although I stayed for about another year afterward, winding down the affairs of the company.
What role did the APA play in a part of actually getting the non-skid industry up and running?
APA?
APA had nothing to do with the start of the non-skid industry. APA was formed after 15 years ago by a group of us that were the holdovers, or what's left of the non-skid industry, and airline guys and gals, and we met once a year. Every year we had a reunion to keep the industry alive, the memory of the industry alive. So APA had nothing to do with the initiation and formation of the non-skid industry. It's a group of people that was in the non-skid age that wanted to stay connected and meet and reacquaint ourselves once a year.
How did the non-skid industry officially begin? Was it one person's idea? Was it just a collective ideas upon everybody that got out of the military? What was the beginnings of it?
It came about as a result of people coming out of the Air Force with flying skills, and there being many surplus aircraft available, and on terrific terms. So these guys would buy an airplane, lease an airplane, do almost anything they could, and they started these airlines. Now, you had to have a certificate to fly the airplanes, but the certificate was not hard to come by. You could apply for it, you could buy them, and there were, 750 or 800 initial non-scheduled certificates that were issued, whatever they were called in those days. A lot of them were for, a lot of the companies were simply just charter airlines. Some of the companies were air taxis. Some of them flew cargo. Some of them flew military contracts for, for the government. There were some, again, like North American and Great Lakes that flew with what I call common carriage. They actually had ticketed passengers that they flew between destinations. But it came about simply because of the fact that you had these two forces that met, people coming out of the Air Force and available aircraft.
What was the camaraderie like between the two, between all the different companies?
Well, for the most part, I was involved in the common carriage end of it, and we got along very well with all of the other carriers that were doing it. In fact, you sort of cooperated with each other. With the North American group, if we had too many passengers, or they had too many passengers and they had room, we would carry them, or they would take our passengers. We'd pay each other, but it worked out very well that way.
How many flights in a week or in a day went from Burbank to New York, and in comparison, how did that affect the scheduled airlines?
Well, I would say that depending on the period, for the most part, between Burbank, Chicago, New York, there were daily flights by the group that I was with. I think North American pretty much had daily flights. There were other carriers that flew, but not on a regular basis. They would sometimes fly passengers. We would get a day that we could keep on booking passengers, and if we could find another carrier that would take them, we would do that. So there were other carriers that would take common carriage passengers, but did not fly on a regular basis. I think U.S. Overseas Airlines also flew on a fairly regular basis between LA and New York.
And what type of competition, how was the competition between the scheduled airlines and the non-scheduled airlines?
Well, there was no competition in that sense. It's sort of always been my belief that the people that flew on the non-scheduled airlines would not have flown on the scheduled airlines anyway. They probably couldn't afford it. They'd have taken a bus or a train or whatever. I don't think that there was really competition. I do think that that the non-skids eventually, because we were getting better and better equipment, did start to impact the scheduled airlines. And as a result of it, they decided that we were more than a thorn in their side and had to do something about it.
I'd like to follow up on what Len said to the two forces. There was the pilots coming out of the Air Force and the surplus airplane. But the third force that was instrumental in the foundation of the non-skid industry was the fact that we felt there was an untapped market. 20%, only 20% of the population of America had never been on an airplane. The bus traffic and the train traffic, that was our focus because those people had never flown an airplane before. So we priced it so that we could attract that type of market. The scheduled airlines were charging $136 to New York. We came in at $99. And that attracted a lot of bus people who've never flown on an airplane, and train traffic. And the other thing I think is we did a lot of things differently. We had to because we didn't have the money for market, for example. Working with North American as a director of operation and vice president of operation, I would go to drugstores and we'd put up our little sign with the drugs in the drugstore with the coupon. If they bought the ticket from the drugstore got a little bit of a break off. That we had to be innovative in the way that we presented ourselves, the way we marketed, the way we flew the airplanes. We knew that the spotlight was on us. But the non-skid industry as a whole did not violate the air traffic or the airworthiness regulations. They were after us on the economic regulations. Two different, CAB was the economic, FAA or CAA in those days was the safety aspect of it. And most of the non-skids as a whole were operated well within the limits.
What reactions did you get from people who had never flown before on their first trip on an airplane? Did you ever have any good reactions?
You know, it was funny. We'd stop, for example, at Prescott, and on a DC-3 with 20 or 28 people on it, and it's a long flight because we stopped at Prescott, Amarillo, Kansas City, Chicago, and Detroit, and it took you about 17 hours to do all that. People got to know people. People got to friendly with people on airplane. People had fun, even though they were sitting in a bucket seat practically with a box lunch and was making all of these stops and spending 17 hours in that aluminum tube that was bouncing up and down because we couldn't get above the bad weather. We had to go through it. But they became friends. It was a happening. That was, and to tell you how this all worked out in the end, when we got DC-6Bs that were pressurized and we're flying them to New York, our load factor for 2 years in a row on the 6Bs was 96.4% of the total capacity of the airplane. But the people loved the old DC-3 days. I mean, everybody got into the act, so to speak. Now, obviously you get the grouch once in a while, but we just throw them off the airplane. Forget it. Can't do that today. It's not politically correct.
Was there a lot of interaction with the pilots or the ground crew with the customers? For instance, nowadays, airlines you almost never see the pilot because of security reasons. But during the flight or anything, was there interaction?
We invited people to come to the cockpit. Kids particularly, we would invite up to see all the instruments. They could stand between the pilots. From the pilot's viewpoint, we did a lot of that with people on, regardless of the airplane we flew, whether DC-3, DC-4, or DC-6. But as a pilot, you would be very cautious about going to the lavatory because you knew that the minute you started back through that cabin with 102 people down the aisle, that friend of yours sitting up front with the mic in the cockpit was going to say, "Passengers, friends, our flight engineer is coming through the cabin now. If you have any questions about this airplane, please feel free to ask." Well, you're trying to get back there. I got stopped. But it was that sort of atmosphere that we worked in, as far as I know, as long as I was in the non-skid business. It was, people had fun, you know. I can remember putting the first TV, tried to do it out of Burbank on our C-46, put a TV up front so people could watch it. But our flight attendants were trained to be nice to people, and it was fun.
How did that compare to the scheduled airlines as far
To
as,
what?
How did that compare with the scheduled airlines as far as?
Well,
pay?
scheduled airlines were very regimentated, and although I must say that until the security things came along, if I was on an airplane and I was a scheduled airline, if I gave my card to a flight attendant, they would take it to the cockpit, and sometimes the cockpit would invite another airliner up front. But as a general rule, they didn't openly invite people to come to the cockpit. It was a different atmosphere whatsoever. I don't fly airplanes anymore as a passenger because I think the service is so deteriorated. It's become a cattle car operation. You know, I hate to get on. I won't fly anymore. It's not like it was.
Leonard, do you have anything
Well,
to add?
people would fly these airlines because it was inexpensive. I mean, and the load factors were always substantial, always in the 90% tile. So that it was not a problem getting the people to fly. In those days, the scheduled airlines on a DC-4 may have had 40 people, and on a DC-4 for the non-skids there were 80. And they introduced the middle seat and all that kind of thing. And in those days, it wasn't happening with the schedule. So people would maybe complain about the seats being tight, but it's no tighter than it is on the sitting 10 abreast on a DC-10 at this point in time. It's just a different. It happened. It started with the non-skids, and when the scheduled airlines started to fly coach flights, they ended up doing the same thing. And you have to, depending on the fare, you have to get a certain amount of money out of the airplane, or it doesn't pay to fly it. So if you reduce your airfares, you have to increase the seating capacity.
In the beginning, from what I understand, the non-scheduled airlines began because there was a surplus of planes and a surplus of pilots. Once it continued on, it grew. Where did you find the financing to buy, let's say, new airplanes? Did you buy new airplanes? Or
Well, I want to correct something. There was not a surplus of airplanes or a surplus of pilots. The airplanes were military surplus. Okay, there was not a surplus of airplanes, and the pilots weren't surplus either. I mean, they came out of the military and wanted to go into the business. But the airlines, the North American group, the Great Lakes group, they were profitable, and when they're profitable, they are able to buy new equipment. They were able to get financing. In some instances, there were financing companies that leased the airplanes. There was a fellow by the name of George Batchelor that used to buy airplanes. He used to buy these, and then he used to lease them to the various and sundry carriers. So it was possible to get equipment. With Great Lakes, they actually bought brand new, right out of the factory, bought DC-6Bs.
How many companies were there altogether during the peak?
Well, again, there were so many, there were, again, 700 non-scheduled carriers, but the number that were in common carriage was minimal, less than, I would say less than 50. Would do that?
Oh, yeah, but I think on the Transcon, it was a lot less than that.
Right.
I mean, you look at flying, there may be a lot of people flying to South America or wherever, or Alaska, but the main route was transcontinental from New York to Burbank or back. That was the main route. That was the real market there was. And on that, there was probably 8 or 10 of us that was in the transcon market along with the scheduled airlines. The one mystery that I've never been able to solve in my own mind is why the scheduled airlines in the first instance didn't buy us out. I mean, they could have bought the whole industry for a cup of coffee, so to speak, if we'd been willing to sell. But they never made that venture. They decided to attack the industry from another viewpoint politically, and they could have bought the whole industry. I mean, you talk about financing airplane. I was relating to Len or somebody earlier. When Kirk Kerkorian and I wanted to buy our first airplane, jet, not that, but a jet, we went to the Bank of America in Los Angeles and talked to Walter Sharp and said, Walter, we need to borrow, I don't know, $3 or $4 million, whatever we're paying for the airplane, to buy this airplane from Delta. And Walter said, well, that's interesting. He says, what have you got for security? We said, nothing. Walter gave us the loan. So business was done differently in those days than it was now in this day. I mean, you had personal relationships. And Walter knew Kirk, knew me. He knew that the airplane was always attachable. And so he just gave us the loan to buy the airplane. Now, you couldn't do that today. I mean, one of your largest contributors is Steve Udvar-Hazy. He bought and leased airplanes, and some of the non-skids got airplanes. I know I was in conversation with his group in the late 50s. We were looking for something. So that was a source of airplane, like George Batchelor and Steve and other people would had the assets to buy the airplane and lease them to us or sell them to us or whatever. But it was a shoestring operation and getting started. The money was won in poker games. Some of these guys came out of the military was pretty well off. They'd been very good at poker and invested it. But they started out very small. As I said earlier, I heard rumors, never saw this, but Kirk's first office was an engine crate at Hawthorne Airport. Now, so that's the way it was born and brought itself up. We didn't have a lot of we had a lot of opposition opposed to it, but not a lot of help. We created the help that we needed.
Why was the Burbank route the most important?
Why was Burbank important? Well, I guess some of us wanted to live in Southern California. We didn't want to operate out of Los Angeles International. I mean, first of all, if we tried to get counter space there, the scheduled airlines had it and they wouldn't give it to us. Burbank opened its arms to us, and Burbank became the Los Angeles base and home for the non-skids. I mean, we were all there. We were all friends. We operated Sabre. We changed parts. If his airplane broke down in Kansas City and I had an engine, I'd give him the engine so he could get his airplane moving. it was like that. And that atmosphere is not available today. It was in our time, and it was wonderful to grow up in the aviation business. In my 60-year airline management, I've been the president of 2 airlines, and my knowledge and the reason I was appointed and was offered a job was because of the training that I got with the non-skid industry. And I can tell you one thing, I don't know how it was with Great Lakes, but I had 4 bosses that owned the airline. And I cannot think of one time that I couldn't walk into any of my bosses at any time and tell him he was wrong. Because we were a family working to make this thing work. And I had actually really 2 bosses. I had Jack Lewin, who was procurement, marketing, and I had Red Hart, who was or Stan Weiss. And I can remember one time I sent a DC-3 to San Francisco to pick up the shuttle, and Jack disagreed with this decision I'd made, and he was just racking me up one side and down the other. And Stan Weiss, the other boss, came in the office and said, "Jack, leave him alone. He did what was right." But it was in that sort of atmosphere and the possibility to learn that provided me the basis for my career. And it worked well and worked well. It worked well for me. I've done a lot of airline consulting. And I'm surprised when I did airline consulting, I'd walk into a company and in 2 weeks, with access to the company, I could tell what the problem was. And I would give them solutions. And I could tell you how many times I would give them my report and they would ignore it. They do it their way. And a lot of them have failed. And I've encouraged Embry-Riddle to have a consulting arm because I think it's needed in this day and age in airline when economics are bad and you have to watch every dollar, you have to get the best out of your airplane, you have to keep your maintenance up so that you're not going to have an accident. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, but I was well-founded with my non-skid experience.
Do you have anything to add?
Well, to go back to your original question, I think was about the Burbank Airport. And at the time the non-skids got started, all the scheduled airlines had moved to LA International. And as a result of it, the Burbank Airport would have died. It was in its death throes. So when the non-skids moved in, I mean, it was the best thing that ever happened to them. The entire airport was a non-skid airport. Everybody in that terminal was a non-scheduled airline. And the airport cooperated with us tremendously. That's why they were very happy to have our display. One of the founders of our organization, David Simmons, who has recently passed away, was the general manager of the Burbank Airport for many years. And the stories that he would tell about the non-skids was incredible. But he was a tough guy in those days, but he was a good guy too. And he supported the airlines, and we did well at Burbank Airport. And they did well as a result of us being there.
Were all the companies successful?
Oh no, not at all.
Do you have any stories with one of them in particular?
Well, when you talk about stories, I didn't get involved with other airlines, and I don't like to tell stories about other airlines. My memory doesn't go back 52 years really all that well. But there were a lot of carriers that just simply didn't make it. They just stopped flying, and they were unable to pay their lease payments, and so the airplanes were were repossessed, and it was not an uncommon thing. George Batchelor was, he used to lease airplanes, and there were times when he would chain up airplanes at the Burbank airport. There was a story about the flying Finn twins.
The
where,
Finn twins.
Yeah, where he chained the airplane down, and they cut the chains and flew the airplane away, and they flew somewhere in Nevada, and they were there on the airplane with a gun, trying to keep people away, and apparently the Finns were twins, so nobody could ever tell which one was doing which. So when they ended up trying to charge somebody for the possession of the weapon, they couldn't do it because they didn't know which one it was. But there are other stories, and probably if you interview other people, they can tell you more about them. That's the only one that comes to mind instantly.
Yeah, the Finn twins were different.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you the ending to the Finn twins. So I was in some foreign country in Europe, and I got in a cab and got to chatting with the cab driver, and it was one of the Finn twins who was driving a cab in this foreign country, Amsterdam or Holland or someplace. It was amazing. But there were failures, but there wasn't that many because we were pretty small industry from what we're talking about. I consider the non-skid industry from 1948 to 1958.
That was his end.
That was it. Well, who's left?
I left. Most of the industry lasted until '62.
Yeah, but you operated differently than we did.
Well, that's true. That's why we lasted until '62.
Because they were then called supplementals, and you were denied common carriage.
Well, in '62 with everybody else, that's correct.
How were the rules and regulations slowly tightened over the years that eventually led to the phase out of the non-skids?
Okay, I can't remember the dates, and in that blue book that I gave you, there's a historical thing about the regulations that came down. But they initially issued a certificate of one type, and then they decided, okay, there's too many of these carriers, so we're now going to recertificate or issue new certificates. And if you didn't get a new certificate, you couldn't fly anymore. So that would eliminate a whole bunch of people. Then they did this again several times, maybe 4, 5, 6 times, eliminating more and more people, until finally the ones that were left were strong enough so that they could fight and bring the thing up to the Supreme Court. And that's exactly what happened. They fought it up to the Supreme Court, and they got ruled against, and that ended the entire group. North American was a slightly different case. They got tired of trying to stay, within these things, and they decided they were going to fight, that they were right. I'm not sure that describes it properly, but that was my opinion of what happened at the time. They just weren't having it anymore. And they decided that they were going to fight it out, and they ended up, as a result of it, getting put out of business several years before everybody else.
Now, you were with part of North America that continued on. Was there any, was there a meeting for the entire company, or what caused you guys to stop fighting the Civil Aeronautics Board and the scheduled airlines? And was it a decision in the management, or did the whole company decide to?
The whole company wasn't very large to begin with in today's standards. I mean, that my 4 bosses decided that, one, that the economic law was prohibiting and restricting people to fly airplanes. And they wanted to make a living, and they wanted to make money, and they wanted to fly. There's no question about that. But they could probably done it other ways. But this economic regulation really got under their saddle blanket, and they just decided to fight it. And we were very fortunate to hire one of the better attorneys, Hardy McClay, in Washington, D.C., that fought the Civil Aeronautics Board time and time. He kept us in business for 10 years, legally. I mean, literally, it was Hardy McClay that every time the board would subpoena us, I can remember being chased by Gerald Stout from the Civil Aeronautics Board across the parking lot at Lockheed Air Terminal. He had a subpoena for me, because I was officer of the company, to deliver, and he got Butler and I in the car, and we rolled up the window so he couldn't serve the subpoena. But my people, my bosses said, we're going to fight this out. It's not right. And we're going to fight out. In the meantime, they were making a lot of money. I'm not going to downplay that at all. Money, economic, profit was part of it. But what drove my four people was this fact that Americans had a right to fly without some sort of restriction. Now, it cost them. As I said at lunchtime, when the Civil Aeronautics Board order came down that put us out of business, they went one step further and said that my bosses could not partake in any airline type operation the rest of their lives.
Did that hold up?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, they didn't, so, you know, I don't know that it held up. They just didn't do it.
Yeah, well, Stan and I tried, but it didn't work out.
Do you guys want to take a break, maybe have some water while we gather some more?
It's okay, it's fine, that's good, okay.
Keep going.
You can do whatever you want.
Okay. Some stories? Okay. I know you were somewhat a pilot. Did you fly a lot for Northwest? Or?
I did. When I first started, I was a pilot. And then I went into management when Cliff Stout quit as a chief pilot for Viking. But I flew both the office chair and airplanes up until the jets came out. And then I have to make a decision. I can either devote my time to this new, more modern, complicated piece of equipment. And frankly, I found it more interesting and challenging to make the whole thing work than one airplane. I mean, flying an airplane is you have moments and moments of stark terror and hours of boredom. And anybody can fly an airplane, but to put all of those pieces together into a successful airline was more intriguing to me than being able to manipulate the controls of an airplane. I never did. I flew airplanes as an officer of the company and a vice president of operations on holidays, Christmas, New Year's, when I wouldn't ask my pilots to do it unless I did it. But that was the type of operation that we had. Everybody was a family. But putting the whole thing together interested me more than flying airplanes. The most flying I ever enjoyed was flying the bush in Africa for 5 years. I flew the African bush, and that was more fun to me than all my DC-3, DC-4, C-46, and DC-6 time all combined.
Why Africa?
Why Africa? I was offered a job in Africa to buy and manage and operate a fixed base operation in Nairobi, and I borrowed the money and bought it. And I'd always dreamed of going to Africa as a young man. When I was telling Sally earlier, most young men like to hunt. And the premier place to hunt is the big five: elephant, rhino, buffalo, lion, and leopard. And I had two opportunities. I could have gone to the Himalayas someplace, or I could have gone to Nairobi. I went to Nairobi. I enjoyed it, and it started something in my soul or heart about Africa that I really, and I've lived, as I told Sally, on the continent for 20 years. But I enjoyed the bush flying a lot, really a lot.
When were you involved with the Canadian airline? Was that before or after?
In 1967, after I got back from Africa in Nairobi, I went to work for Ed Daly at World Airways as vice president of passenger services or something. But I couldn't stand Ed. He was a tyrant. And so after 6 months, I was offered this presidency of Transair Limited in Winnipeg. And boy, I was gone like a shot. And one night I was laying in bed in Winnipeg, and Ed Daly was flying up above with his telephone. He said, "Hal, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm trying to go to sleep." He said, "I want you to come back to work for me." And I said, "Ed Daly, I wouldn't come back to work for you for every ounce of money you could put in my pocket." But I was the president of Transair, little scheduled airline carrier. I merged it with Pacific Western Airlines in Calgary. We then bought Canadian Pacific, which was our West Coast competitor, and then Air Canada bought us and turned it into Canadian Airlines International. So I spent, I think it was about 14 years in Canada in that sort of business.
After that, what did you do?
After that, I volunteered, as I was telling Sally, with an organization called the International Executive Service Corps. And keep this in mind for when you retire. They offered old people like Len and myself the opportunity to volunteer to go to a foreign country and use our expertise in the private sector area, whatever expertise we had, to help develop the private sectors of third world emerging countries. We had a volunteer that went one time to Russia, and he put bulldozer blades on tanks because they didn't have bulldozers. So he took a tank, built a thing, put bulldozer. I went to Africa, and my expertise wasn't really airtime, I was management. I was a country director in these countries to handle our volunteers when they came in. But for example, I helped a lady who imported beans from South Africa into Zimbabwe or Zambia, I forget which. And she didn't know how to market them. She didn't know how to package it. She didn't know how to price it. But she wanted to do this. So we helped her set up a bank account, how to put it in a sack, how to price it, and how to market it. Because Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, after independence, went to hell in a bad handbasket because of the political situation. But the one country that didn't was South Africa. And one reason that didn't is because South Africa had a very strong private sector. And it was the private sector that kept South Africa economically superior to everything else. And the Executive Service Corps and USAID, who funded the Executive Service Corps, saw that need in other countries, just to build up that private sector of the country so that it could retain some freedom from dictatorships. That's what I did for 12 years after I quit flying messing with airplanes.
Leonard, what about you? What happened to you after 1962?
Well, it took about a year to close down Skycoach because we had offices all over the country. We owed money to different air carriers. They owed money, money to us. So it took about a year to close it down. During that year, we operated an intrastate airline called Trans-California, although I wasn't all that involved in it, but it was operational, and I handled the ticket management for that company. And after that year, I went to work for a company that financed student loans, private student loans, for people who went to vocational schools, flight schools, truck schools, and that type of thing. And I eventually bought a business, and so that business lasted probably for, I don't know, 40 years. And I eventually sold the business. I had my boys in the business with me, and eventually sold the business.
What about everybody else that was involved with the non-sked industry? What happened to them, and where did they go?
Well, the pilots, for the most part, actually continued to fly for somebody. There was a company called Aerospace Lines that flew the early rockets between points, and they took an airplane and they converted it. So it was called the Guppy. And it was one of the first one of those. So there were a lot of guys that flew for Aerospace Lines, and they flew for other carriers. There were other carriers around that, and they got hired.
Didn't Fish die in an accident in one of those guppies?
Don't know.
I think he did. He was flying it for that outfit out of Santa Barbara.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
Aerospace Lines.
Yeah.
Jack Conroy.
Yeah, Jack Conroy, that's correct.
Yeah.
How did the ticketing work? The day-to-day operations?
Well, the tickets in those days were they were not sold by the same ticket agencies that were selling for the scheduled airlines. There were ticket agencies that were ultimately established for non-sked, airlines, and because there were enough of them so that they could make a living. But when they first started, like Hal said, you did advertising any way you could. You put the little flyers out. You advertised in the display sections of the newspapers. We had ticket offices in the various downtown areas of the city. We tried to get everybody to pay ahead of time because you wanted to, it was part of your space control. When somebody pays at the counter, they're less likely to show up than somebody that you've gotten to pay their money in advance. So we actually had people that would go out and deliver the tickets, and again, through ticket offices and so on. But that's how the tickets were sold and marketed.
I'd like to go back to something that Len said about reservations. Did I take a reservation? You have Sabre and you have all these computers these days, and instant everything. We had to build a circular table with those things that fold over and have index cards you can put in it, slots. And we had that circle on that table, and the reservationists would sit at this round table with the phones, and if somebody wanted to fly on such and such a date, she'd turn the circle around until she got to the index card holder, and then she'd put the reservation in. So there was a lot of innovations that we brought into the industry that is in use today in one way or another. So we had to be innovative because we were there by ourselves trying to do it and make it work with limited funds. And at least when we started, we had limited funds. But it was those things that we brought, that we helped, I think, helped the industry as a whole.
Those cards were then taken because it was part of what you called space control. And somebody would then pull these cards out, and then they would mark on a board how many people you had going between here and New York and between so on. And then you had to make sure that if you had an 80-seat airplane going between Los Angeles and New York, stopping in Chicago, you had 40 people getting off in Chicago. You wanted to put 40 people on in Chicago to fill those empty seats. So now you had to get the information to the people in Chicago that we have we have 40 people going to Chicago, now you need to fill 40 seats. And that's, so there was a space control. And the master space control was kept in Burbank, but each individual office, airport office, had to have their own space control. And generally once a day, some guy that was a really terrific typist, we used to sit down at this machine called a Twix machine. Yeah, and he used to sit there and he'd hammer out all these numbers, and everybody would put them up, and that was how the space control worked. And again, hopefully, because what would happen is that on Tuesday we had 100 people, and if we were supposed to get a DC-6 from Great Lakes on that day, and all of a sudden Great Lakes said, we got a maintenance problem, so you called this other airline, and they only had an 80-seat DC-4. So now you had to handle the 20 people. So all of these were part of the daily operation of maintaining these airlines.
And as an operations guy in charge of operations, airlines is not a 8-hour shift day, it's 24 hours. And had like this Rolexing, I had a book with all of the pilots' phone numbers in it, all the flight attendants' phone numbers in it, and all the airplanes in it, and the schedules that I had scheduled, what crews are going on, what airplane from where. And I'd get these calls in the middle of the night, the pilot would call up and say, Hal, I'm in Podunk, Alaska, where do I go next? And I'd have to look through my book and tell him where he's take the airplane and pick up the next load. One night I got a call from Captain Gathico at DC-4. He delivered his charter or his chem flight to San Diego, and he called from San Diego, 2 o'clock in the morning. He said, Hal, where am I supposed to go next? And I said, you got to load up at San Francisco, go to Oakland. And about an hour, 2-3 hours later, I got a call from Gathico. He said, Hal, you've finally done it. You've sent me to some place where there's no load. But it got so routine in the middle of the night, that I knew where the next load was supposed to be for that airplane, but I sure screwed up. But so we did a lot of innovations, taking the business home at night, taking your work home. I had to every night. I had to take it home with me because there was nobody else. We didn't have computers. We didn't have even good communications. Everything was done by phone.
On average, how many employees were involved with each company?
Oh my goodness, I don't think we had in North America more than 175, 200?
I would say that's probably...
Somewhere like that. Pilots, flight attendants and the reservations people, accounting, and we had the station managers around. So we weren't very large in the sense as you'd look at today, but we were everybody worked hard in the company. There wasn't anybody. I've loaded baggage. I used to work my days in the office. The flights left at Burbank at 9 o'clock. I would go out, stay after work, and load the baggage, help load the baggage on the airplane. And the last thing I did before I went home at 11 o'clock was to send the Twix to Kansas City that the flight is off and on its way with X number of passengers. But when I went home, I had the book with me. And I'd be back there the next morning to meet the inbound airplane, the westbound airplane, and have the shuttle crew with the DC-3 sitting there, and I'd help move the baggage to the DC-3 so that we get to passengers in San Francisco. That was the way we operated. And everybody, I was no different than anybody else in the airline. I mean, people worked because they were enthused about it. It was a family.
Well, as I said earlier, when I first went to work for Skycoach, I think I was probably 22 years old. And I had opportunities there that I could have never gotten anywhere else. And one of the things that was important is you saw how you fit within the thing. If you didn't do something, I mean, it would fail. You would be responsible for somebody else's failure. And it was the same thing that was true about when you started an operation. You had to make sure that you had everything covered, that there was somebody to cover all these things. When we started to fly to Hawaii, marketing was different, because when you take Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, you always have somebody that wants to fly from New York to Los Angeles, or somebody who wants to fly from Los Angeles to New York. But you don't have too many people who want to fly from from Honolulu to Los Angeles. You get a lot of people that want to fly from here to there. So you have to establish, you had to set up a tour operation and everything, so that you created a market, so that there were people that you could bring back, so that you could operate these airplanes. And we ended up doing Hawaii because you end up with the aircraft utilization. You have this certain number of airplanes, you have a certain number of seats, and you got to have destinations. And if you're limited, these carriers are limited to 10 flights in between any points. You got to have a lot of points that they can fly between. So you have to set up these operations and make sure that you can run them successfully and have the people that can handle it. And this is effectively what occurred, and it's why Hal says there was so much cooperation, because everybody, if you didn't do your job, there would be an absolute failure.
And the other thing I think that the non-skid at least did for me, and I would think also for Len and others, it taught us to think on our feet and out of the box. And I'll just give you one quick example. As the Director of Operations and Vice President of Operations in North America, it was my responsibility to get all these things organized. Captain Gathercole, again, had an engine failure at a little F-86 fighter base during the Korean War, and I got the word back that they needed to send an engine to his airplane. And we could bump cargo with mats and put our engine on and get it there. And I looked around to hurry up and get an airplane and the crew up to Travis to do this and to take the flight out, and I was short a reserve captain. I didn't have one. So I called one of our check pilots, Bud Ewing, and Bud Winder over to our FAA officer, and I said, take me out and check me out in this airplane as a captain. So I went up and did the check and passed. Although they had a little bit of fun with me. There's a thing on the airplane between 2 and 3 engine that runs a vacuum, and you can have it on 2 or number 2 engine, and that runs your artificial horizon, the vacuum. And I'm under the hood, of course, and Bud Winder, the FAA guy, switched it over, and all of a sudden my artificial horizon was doing this, and I was chasing the horizon with this thing. And they were laughing at me. But anyway, I passed and I went out on this trip. A 3-man took along one of our co-pilots who had a A&E, so we could change this engine. We went to Pingtung, Formosa. And Gathercole took our good airplane and left us with the bad airplane. So the A&E co-pilot and I changed the engine on that DC-4. In taking I said to Bryce Calclaser, my maintenance guy, be sure to put a prop seal in the spare parts kit, because when you take the prop off, you break the seal. You can't fly, you can't put the prop back. And when we took the prop off, we broke the seal. And I said, what do we do now? And I said, well, CAT, Civil Air Transport, has an office over there about 80 miles. So I borrowed a Jeep from the Marines, and I drove the 80 miles. I walked up to the supply guy, and I said, do you happen to have an R2000 Hamilton Standard prop seal? He says, how many do you want? I said, I'll take 2. And I got in the Jeep, drove back, and we, the co-pilot and I, put the engine on the airplane, we test ran it, and Captain Ewing decided that then they closed down the airport because there was the Chinese were coming across and they're to fight. And they closed the airport, turned out all the lights, and all flights were canceled. And we were sitting out there running up the engines on the airplane to make sure they were all right. And Bud decided he was not going to sit on this airport with those MiGs over there coming at us and shooting us on the ground. And so he moved into position, no lights on the runway. He poured the coal to the DC-4 and we went up. And immediately, we turned off all the lights, of course, and immediately we got up. He says, Hal, for Christ's sakes, talk to air traffic control and tell them who we are. And we left and went on to Seoul, delivered the cargo. But, you know, you have to think. You have to improvise. You have to think out of the box. And if there's one lesson that I think all young people should learn today, particularly in the Navy, is you have to be fast on your feet. You have to be able to think. You have to think logically, and you have to think out of the box. You can't put yourself in this box and stay there because everything changes. And today it's changing a lot faster than it did in our day.
We covered just about everything. I do have one kind of important question, and it's in two parts, really. If you could give advice or words of encouragement to the students today that are aspiring to be a professional pilot or to get into the aviation industry, what would you tell them?
I was there one time, and what I did was against all logical odds. Learned to fly in 1947 and get an airline career when there were all of these pilots coming out. I mean, they were every place. The one word of wisdom I have is follow your dream. Follow it. Don't let it beat you. Think about it. Work at it. You don't get ahead by not working at it, and you have to make it happen. And one of the things to hold on to is your dream. What is it? And I'm going to do it. And be positive about it. I've taken people on safari in Africa many times. And if you take somebody on safari in Africa, they want to see lions and elephant and rhino. So you start out in the morning with these people with that's the goal. But if there's a bird watcher in that group, he wants to stop and look at every lilac-breasted roller that he sees. And I've seen 14,639 of them. But you see, that gets you off your dream. The other people want to see how you have to make it happen. They're not going to walk up to you and stand in front of your camera. You have to make it happen. You have to work at it. You have to keep that goal in mind. And don't get sidetracked with lilac-breasted rollers or whatever. But the dream, you have to keep alive and you have to keep working at it. And young people today, I think, have a tougher time than Len and I did because the environment has changed. You know, there was opportunities and you could make things happen. But today things are so boxed in with regulations and political correctness and whatever, that unless you keep that dream in front of you, it ain't gonna happen. Believe me. So you have to keep that star in front of you and follow it. And don't let circumstances, environment, or somebody else detour you. It just takes a lot of hard work. And you have to create your own luck. There's no such thing as luck free. You've got to create it. I don't know how Len feels about it.
Well, I don't have as many words as you do, but you know, basically, I think it's true of any industry, whether it be aviation or anything that you do. When you come out into the world, you have a job opportunity, and it's presented to you. Whether that's the only job opportunity that there is out there, or it's the one that you select, and the one that you select, that's what you're going to do. And whenever you get an opportunity, you start to work for a company, you do the very best you can. and you make the most out of every opportunity that's presented to you. And if you do that, you'll be a lot happier in life and you'll do a lot better. If you just sit there and you say, this is a crappy job and I'm just going to put my time in, you ain't never going to get anywhere and you're not going to be happy. In order to make anything out of yourself, any kind of a success, or have any happiness in life, is to do the best you can with what you got. And that's what I would have to say about it.
And make friends, not enemies.
True.
That about covers everything that I have. AJ, do you have anything else that you want to wrap up with?
I don't think so. I think that was a very good wrap on the whole interview, and we thank you guys both for coming to Prescott, Arizona, helping set up the display, and we hope to be able to interview more people from the Aviation Pioneers Association and learn the story of the non-scheduled airline industry, as well as the stories of the people who were involved in it. So I thank you guys very much for coming out.
Okay, well, thank you for having us.
Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
No, except that I'd just like to, I feel at home with what's the name of this place? But I feel also strongly about how to help the young people follow the same path I did and be successful and happy in their choice. And that's a real key. And Bill and I talked about it one time, Steve, several years ago, about having a time when people, and Len and I could sit down and talk to the students, have a sit down talk, and let our experiences and our wisdom out to young people. I can't get my own kids to listen to me, but I might be able to get somebody else. Although I must say, my son is a senior captain for Hawaiian Airlines, and due to retire in 367 days, he said. He keeps track now. My grandson, who graduated from Embry-Riddle, is a co-pilot for Hawaiian Airlines. So we're a three-family group, and I have a great-grandson who was born, I don't keep track of babies, 6 months or 8 months ago, and I sent him a logbook, pilot's logbook. And I said, I expect you to fill this out and keep the dream alive. So number 4 is in the mail. I said, I bought a logbook, put his name in it and sent it to him. But the young people is the future for tomorrow. And it's young people that we need to help as much as we can, any way we can, us older guys. And I found that working with these people in Africa. You know, they're like children in a lot of respects, or young people. They don't know. But in the process of me helping them, they helped me. Because I went and worked with a guy who was manufacturing lead pencils, writing pen. And I learned more about how to make a lead pencil than I didn't know they had to be made out of redwood, for example, or that the lead had to be imported or whatever in the redwood. So it's a two-way street. We may have spent 60, 70, 80 years on this earth and have accumulated a lot of things, but if we hide it within here and don't give it out to the younger people, we're shorting ourselves and them. That's all I got to say.
Well, I also want to thank Dr. Frank Ayers, Bill Thompson, Steve Babinski, Drs. Holly Bloom, and Barbara Martins, and everyone else who made this project possible. And I truly want to thank you both for taking the time to sit down with us and share some of your incredible stories. It really has been an honor, and I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did it give you chills?
Yeah.